Welcome everyone to today's Design and Dialogue. We have Kate Wagner today. So we're going to record the entire conversation. If any of your friends or families miss any part of this, you're welcome to watch them shortly after this conversation ends. We're also going to mute everyone just to ensure the background clarity. And welcome also to drop down your hellos, where you're from, as well as your questions for Kate in the public chat box, so we can go through them during the Q&A. Now let's turn to Glenn Adamson.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And hey, Kate, good morning to you.
Good morning.
So you're zooming in from New York City?
No, from DC.
Oh, from DC, sorry. Our nation's capital. How are things down there?
It's starting to get humid, which DC is infamous for. You kind of feel like a boiling shrimp. And I'm moving to Chicago soon because I'm kosher. Like, I can't be a shrimp that boils.
I see.
No.
So when are you heading out there?
August.
All right, congratulations.
Thank you.
If those who are listening would care to, please let us know where you're calling in from. We're just very curious to know where our audience is. Kate, I think we can go ahead and start your images.
Cool. I'm going to share my screen.
So we're going to do something a little unusual today, and this was partly at my request, although I have to say you took the bit and ran with it, because I asked you, Kate, whether you would be interested to speak on the worst architecture of the century so far, and so this is what we've come up with.
Yes. So I made this PowerPoint on criticism, and I've decided to title it "All That Is Solid Melts Into Bullshit." Of course, being a reference to All That Is Solid Melts Into Air by Marshall Berman, one of the greatest books of all time. Please read it. And as you can see, that image is of the Heatherwick Park that's currently going up and kind of looks like a displaced highway. So let's get started here. So this presentation is going to be about criticism. Cool. It's about buildings that make criticism necessary. It's a presentation about the dumbest renderings, like the perils of value engineering, cynicism, PR, and more. And it's really a presentation about why I wish my job as a critic were a little bit more pleasant, because it's not always fun to be the mean critic all of the time. However, it is definitely fun to be the mean critic some of the time. Everyone loves to be the mean critic occasionally.
And we should say you're going to get to some positive examples at the end, so it's not going to be all dishing.
Yes. There are buildings, in fact, that I love deeply. And so I will be sharing some of those. So I'll be talking about this term, P-architecture, which I either coined or revived. It's not exactly determined yet. Where it is, where it came from, why it's bad. And then the terrible buildings that sort of come from the architectural culture that engenders P-architecture in the first place. And then I will end with some good buildings, 5 of them. So let's get started because I have to breeze through this a little bit quickly. And also it won't let me use my arrow keys.
Let's do it.
Okay. So a little about who I am. My name is Kate Wagner. I'm an architecture critic. I created the blog McMansion Hell, which went viral in 2016 and then went viral again in 2017 when Zillow tried to sue me. They did not. Thank you to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And then, so over the course of the last 4 years, I started freelance writing on the side. And so I started with really kind of small publications, like the 99% Visible blog, some site named Curbly, which I don't even know if it's around anymore. To sort of medium tier blogs and websites like Curb, Architectural Digest, and then finally to sort of more mainstream publications like The Atlantic and The Nation. So aside from doing McMansion Hell, sort of my biggest post now is I'm the architecture critic at the New Republic, where I have a print column titled America by Design, which runs every other issue. And that made me the youngest syndicated architecture critic in American history, which is something that my mom loves to tell people. And so a little bit about being an architecture critic. It sounds like it's really prestigious. I make about as much as a public school teacher. I know because that's what my husband does. He's a math teacher. And then prestige, there is some prestige. As we can see, lots of people came in to come hear me talk, which makes me feel really warm and fuzzy inside. But also, if you express an opinion that people don't like, people are like, well, what do you know? You're just a blogger, which is kind of funny because, yeah, you're insulting me by calling me what I do. Very cool. I did not go to architecture school. And I put here, neither did Ada Louise Huxtable. And we did not go to architecture school for very similar reasons, namely that back in Ada Louise Huxtable's day in the 20th century, early 20th century to mid 20th century, women did not go to architecture school. And back in Kate Wagner day, in like the early 2010s when I was in high school, my high school guidance counselor said I should not go to architecture school because I had a B+ in algebra 2. And fame. Lots of people follow me and I have to go to therapy. That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay. So back onto this. So architects think that they are immune to criticism, basically because their buildings do not look like McMansions. This is like a terrible McMansion, by the way. I tried to pick one of like the worst examples in recent history. And this one's actually Canadian, which is rare. Rare McMansions. But architecture is not immune to criticism, obviously. It has its own sort of embarrassing fallacies, tone-deaf solutions, ridiculous practices, and insipid imagery. And most of this content, like McMansions themselves, are produced for the same reason, which is to get attention. And we live in an attention economy, so this is very lucrative. And also like McMansions, what most of architecture produces begins as sort of ambitious illustrations and ideas that kind of end up being undermined by their own execution. I bet the person who was designing this house thought it was going to look like a combination between, I don't even know, actually. I guess they were going for like log cabin vibes mixed with like gentrification chic, but it ended up just being like basically hell.
Hey,
and
Kate,
so, yeah, go
can I ask
ahead.
you a question?
Yes.
How did you come up with this idea of annotating the images of these commercially available real estate shots? What was the kind of genesis of that methodology?
I actually just thought it was the easiest way to sort of explain what was going on in the image and like draw attention to certain details. I first started using a screenshot annotator actually when I was in my post-tonal theory class in music school to annotate scores. And so I developed like it as a useful tool for pointing out information. And a lot of people are visual learners, and I'm a visual learner. And it sort of developed into its own system and its own visual language, which is funny because it was literally done forever in a Google Chrome extension. It's only recently that I started doing it in Illustrator and Photoshop, just because it's less rasterized.
It does seem like a sort of headlong collision of these two completely different fields, one being architecture, the other being internet, social media, culture. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what your thoughts on that are. You know, it seems to me that your role as a critic is almost unique in the sense that you introduced a totally new way of talking about architecture and buildings with this often snide but actually quite perceptive and incisive way of, you know, dismantling something like Betsy DeVos's hideous mansion or whatever the topic is, and you sort of fillet it like, you know, you're using a kind of stiletto on it using this technique.
I think that part of the influence came from actually Charles Jenks, who was a big influence on me in high school, mostly because the community college library that I went to for books stopped getting architecture books around 1990, and that was like at the height of Charles Jenks. And so like Charles Jenks has these images that are like parodic images of buildings. Like I think he draws like Le Corbusier's Bronchamp is like a tricorn hat, which is really funny, by the way. And so like using this sort of visual humor with architecture is something that sort of came from that. I think also part of it is there is like, I agree, there is like an internet aesthetic to the images, which, I mean, I am like a digital native and probably one of the earliest digital natives. My dad worked for the federal government. He was basically a spreadsheet jockey. His job was to like index medical equipment at Army hospitals. And so he had a computer way before everyone else did. And so I was like a child. We got internet like way before anyone else in our like little like North Carolina town did. When I was in the 5th grade, the school got its first like computer lab with internet, to give you an example. That was 2005. Sorry, I'm like a baby. And so by that point, I'd already been using the internet and using the internet to seek answers to things. And so I sort of just grew up in that digital culture. and like all of the things that came later, like MySpace, for example, and then like GeoCities, all of that stuff was sort of, I grew up alongside of the internet in a lot of ways. And so soaking in that digital aesthetic and that digital culture was part of just like how I came to be. Also, I had no friends, and so I spent a lot of time on the internet. No, I'm serious. Like, I would rather spend time like with books or the internet than other people. And I didn't reform that practice until I was in college.
Yeah, so you ended up with 74,000 Twitter followers, but the genesis was a degree of loneliness, which is interesting. I did want to also just mention an interesting historiographical point there, which is that, of course, Charles Jenks is mainly known for having, if not coined, then certainly proliferated the term postmodernism. And insofar as the internet is often thought of as sort of postmodernism released into the wild, it's very interesting that you had that direct connection to his work.
Yeah, I agree. And also I think the internet has also adopted or at least appropriated like postmodern aesthetics, especially in terms of like vaporwave, which is an interesting parallel to like just like basically like this is like an aesthetics of ugliness in a way, just like how people like fetishize Windows 95 because it brings a certain nostalgia from when the internet wasn't so sleek and minimalist and was actually just like a messy and chaotic place. I think the images also sort of bring back that same visual nostalgia. And I agree, they're very postmodern images. I think this form of annotation it's like a sort of intertextuality in and of itself, which is an interesting way of thinking about it.
Let's carry on with the critique itself.
Yes. So I recently wrote about p-architecture, which is a term I coined in an essay, or at least elaborated on in an essay that I wrote about how brands and firms are basically using the coronavirus to get attention on design websites, and how it's like all basically garbage that will never happen. And so I elaborated on this p-architecture thing for the Architects newspaper in an article I published a few days ago. And so I'll explain a little bit of what this is, but and it does have its roots, of course, in paper architecture. But back when architects used to kind of propose impossible things, back in the 70s especially, those proposals were like interesting and imaginative. I mean, cities that walked, cities that never stopped, erotic collages involving Marina City. If you are a super studio nerd like me, you'll know what I'm talking about. They sort of came to be subjects of what critics at the time called paper architecture. And they called it paper architecture because it would never exist off of paper for the most part. And of course, paper architecture still exists, I guess, in a few sort of imaginative firms and in the halls of the academy and in the dreams of the students at the academy. But it's sort of mostly been replaced with, and again, this is after we talked about postmodernism, decades of postmodernist historical fever dreams about the past and how to integrate the past into sort of modern construction methods. Rather than like weird futurism, which kind of died down or like was seen more in other fields, like for example, like fiction was sort of more future oriented at the time than architecture, which is definitely more past oriented. And so this was followed by the dawn of the internet age and like the attention engine of social media, its attendant image driven economy. And the result is basically p-architecture. And so what is p-architecture? It's the architecture of the click economy. And I chose two examples here because they are both like, egregious for different reasons. The Burger King social distancing crowns is very funny, but also like kind of dark. How to spot p-architecture. So basically it's like architectural vaporware. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, it's a term that comes from the tech industry about like insane like proposed projects that will just like never happen. I mean, I always think of like Hyperloop now, like that's vaporware. Like they're never actually going to build that. Though it always ends up in the news because it's like very exciting or whatever. They can put a car in like a tunnel.
Kate, I also know that you coined another term, which is corona grifting.
Oh yeah, corona grifting, which like the Burger King giant social distancing crowns is like the peak of corona grifting. It's basically being like, we care, and like we are using design to solve the problem of the coronavirus, which is a social problem and political problem.
So
Um,
is your feeling that, leaving aside these more explicit exploitative instances where design is almost trying to cash in the attention economy sense
mhm.
on the pandemic, is it your feeling that designers have an obligation to be very upfront about what they can and cannot solve at a time like this?
I think that is true. I think that there should also just be like a general culture of self-skepticism in the design fields. Like if someone comes to you and say like we're going to solve coronavirus with the blockchain or whatever, you should just be able to say that's stupid, you know? Like or like giant social distancing crowns. Like it's like you're making a mockery of a crisis that has taken like thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands probably at this point. And like has caused like mass like economic crises, and you're just like haha big crown. Like
Mm.
I mean that is just insulting, and it's equally insulting in the top image too, right? Where it's like this is never going to happen. They are never going to put a COVID-19 hospital in like Brandenburg Airport, which is itself like just like an architectural just like nightmare, right? And so they're never going to do this uh, because they already like Germany was much more prepared to handle with the coronavirus than like the US, which is just like a walking disaster.
Mm.
And so like, but this firm comes in, it's like look at these macabre renderings. First of all, like this is not like how PPE works in terms of like those, like a little tiny flimsy like curtain is not exactly, going to protect anyone from the coronavirus. Like I have my future sister-in-law is like a cardiologist, and so like the stuff she describes about how to like actually like get in contact with like COVID people is like insane. Like I mean, it is a lot of preparation, a lot of isolation. This is not what it is. And so like they make this macabre rendering of like carrying like a dead body in an airport, basically just say like we care about this problem, like we at firm care, which is I mean really kind of it's like pay attention to me during the crisis. You're really capitalizing on fear and on crisis itself. And so like let's go back to PR architecture because we really got to get into the buildings here.
Yes.
They're centered on sleek renderings and images. The rendering is the medium of PR architecture. I mean, like any kind of abstraction or anything that could pose questions, including plans and sections, for example, like that's too difficult to like sell on Instagram. Like no one wants to look at pictures of like black and white architectural drawings. So the rendering is the imagery of PR architecture. And of course, it always latches itself on a timely problem. And this is always just like homelessness, income inequality, climate change, the coronavirus, etc. And it's always a surface level or it's sort of like technocratic and not solution. Like it doesn't actually like get into solving like the practical, like political or social core of the problem. I mean, the Burger King crowns are like a great example for obvious reasons. And of course, the solutions always involve buying, selling, or producing something consumable, whether that's images, like in the first image on here, like you're selling basically in images, like this is what our firm can produce, like pay attention to us, click on me, give me ad revenue. Or you're doing the second thing, which is like buy a giant Burger King crown, I guess. It's always something consumable. And it always uses the language of PR, which is like, we at brand are very concerned about this issue, or we are living in unprecedented times and we need solutions at the intersections of X and Y, and it's of course jargon heavy, every word ends in itty, right? Like simplicity or, whatever. It's like multiplicity, just like everything ends in Y, ITY. And of course, like the AI, blockchain, 3D printing, whatever gimmick the tech industry comes up with at any given moment, architecture has to, for some reason, take completely seriously at face value, which is just like so dumb. I mean, you're not like angel investors, like you have, it's kind of funny. So, and here's why it's bad, obviously. So it capitalizes on and profits off of, like I said, social, political, economic crises and the suffering of others, which is really egregious in a lot of ways. And PR write-ups are increasingly replacing real architectural journalism and criticism. And of course, like this, like constant PR bullshit always erases the work of architects and designers who are actually like seriously working on issues. Either that or they like lionize or patronize them, which is like somehow even more annoying. And so PR basically serves, PR as an institution, public relations as an institution, serves to mollify outsiders who are mad about something. Like basically it's a defensive measure. It's like we at Amazon care about Black Lives Matter, even though like we like intimidated like a Black worker for calling out the working conditions during the coronavirus. Like we made that person's life miserable. Like it's like we at brand care about this issue. We're very woke. Like you don't have to pay attention to anything beneath the curtain. The man behind the curtain is not there. We at whatever architect firm cares very seriously about climate change, which is why you can ignore like the labor issues that we have within our own firm, like unpaid internships or like insane working hours or et cetera. You know, it always serves on the defensive, and it reinforces the starchitect, the unhealthy hero and image worship that architecture like loves to have. I mean, this is like the key problem of architecture, basically, in my opinion. And it rewards always this design will save us technocratic thinking and the field's impulse to always hop on whatever the latest technological trend is. And it's always funny when it's something like Bitcoin, because that's absolutely ridiculous. And this, of course, centers and promotes like the rendering above all other forms of architectural representation, especially any that have any kind of abstraction, because it's easier to like picture like video game condos than it is to actually read a plan and see how everything comes together, which I think personally anybody can read a plan. Like you don't have to be an architecture person to read a plan. Like you can make one-on-one sort of analogous mappings of what a plan is saying without ever having to like study architecture. But you would not know this or like believe this based on like what kind of imagery always gets put out there.
Hey, Kate, that makes me wonder whether you think that a lot of the phenomena that you're describing have to do with a root cause, which is that the digital is entering the soul of the practice of architecture, because of, like the rendering-itis that you're describing, for example.
I don't even think it's the digital at its heart. I think of course, like I think digital technologies are very helpful in architecture, even though they do have their limitations. But the problem is a reliance on technology and technocratic thinking at its core. The belief that technology is somehow a solution to problems that are not technological problems. And that's a problem that happens in all, like a lot of fields. It's not just architecture and it's not just design. I mean, it's urbanism. It's technology itself has this problem. Like, I mean, people like, I mean, we have this culture where people think that like any social problem is going to be solved with an app or something. I mean, it's ridiculous. Like this, like we've got innovation brain. We can't like stop that, like take a step back and say like, what is actually like the right thing to do? Like, what can we do in our like everyday practice that helps better this situation? Because that's hard. Like making a building, like realizing it to completion means that it exists in the real world. And when it exists in the real world, it is open to criticism. And when it is executed within the boundaries of whatever exploitative system, capitalism, you know, racism, all of this, it is open to criticisms of that because now it exists in the world, if that makes sense. When it exists on paper, it is immune to that kind of criticism because it's not real. You like, it's not executed. Like somebody's labor didn't go into building this building across several different fields. Like somebody, like some like intern in like the rendering workshop in your firm like did this, and that's exploitative enough, obviously, because the interns never get paid enough. But you did not, like, if you realize a building to completion, it is open season for criticism. And it's much easier and cheaper to just make images and headlines. And I think that's really the problem. And it is a problem that is rewarded in architecture. I mean, the whole culture of architectural journalism now is just like, it's PR. It's like Art Daily, Design Boom. Like occasionally, like there'll be like a critical article in there, like, you know, one critical article for like 150 like Instagrammable pictures of house porn. And criticism is just like not equipped to handle that. And that's really a problem. It's a problem of technocratic thinking, and it's a problem of the culture of criticism in architecture. There's simply just not enough critics to deal with the imagery. And so like the architecture is not held accountable for this way of thinking. Does that make sense?
Yes. And so now you're going to move us on to the actual impact of this on the built environment. Yes.
So I'm going to breeze through this here. So basically, a lot of this can be just like, I think that like I chose these buildings because they each represent basically a fallacy or a reliance in architecture on like some idea that just becomes like hegemonic and headline grabbing. and the execution is like kind of always bad. So the first one, so we'll just go through them. We don't have to summarize them here. So I started with like indulgence, which is not actually like a trend in architecture necessarily in the same way as like putting trees on balconies is like a trend in architecture. But I mean, the luxury building is a stain on the world in a lot of ways. And I chose, of course, 157, which is terrible. I mean, it's, first of all, it's a terrible building. I don't know how like Putnam Park made glass look like plastic. And I'm sure it was very expensive to do this, but he did. And like I said, in the little sidebar here, some buildings openly display their disdain for the average person, and they serve as explicit symbols of wealth. And some of these are at least interesting or good looking, and 157 is neither of these. It was supposed to resemble like a sensuous waterfall that rises above Central Park. I guess that's where the little waves came from, but I guess they valued engineered like the rest of the waves, and so now it just looks like a pinstripe suit. And so the reason why this is just so egregious to me personally is that in New York City alone, 1 in 5 people live beneath the poverty line, which is just a classic example. This is a classic example of like architects, just like there's no internal criticisms. Like, is this the right thing to do? Like, who does this benefit? And also, of course, I put the headline here about the 2-year-old who has like a $6 million condo in this building. Because it's just like, I mean, it is just the excesses of wealth personified to me, this building. And all of like the insipid things that people hate about like luxury development, which is like, you know, glass wall, glass cladding, and just like it's huge and it doesn't like blend in with the environment, and it just like it's always advertising just like how much money is there. I mean, this is really like glass really has become the urban equivalent of like the McMansion in a way. I know everyone likes to like point at like those like EFIS clad like apartment buildings that are like 5 stories, but those have like sort of a mixed background. Like you can't always look at a building like that and say like, oh, that's a luxury building. But when you're talking about like you know, a 200 floor or whatever like glass skyscraper like this, like, you know, that's like a luxury condo building. Like there's no other like visual explanation for it except maybe like a corporate office building, which is equally as bad. So.
And as we know, many of these buildings are spending much of their time empty because owned by absentee landlords, etc.
Yeah, there's a whole system of inequality that perpetuates these buildings, and we should be more critical of that. Of course, I had to put the Edmonton Public Library. This is just like a classic example of rendering brain. And it's sad. It is sad. I mean, and this building is really a combination of 2 problems in architecture: credulity and value engineering. And by credulity, I mean, it is believing that the building is going to look just like the rendering, which frankly, it never does. Let's just be clear here. Very, very rarely does the building look like the rendering, especially if there's glass in that building. But credulity is it's like, and when it's not, it's like, it's believing that what is presented in the rendering is technologically or financially feasible. And when that is not the case, the rendering gets revised, like we can see in the second image here. And it gets a little bit more honest. Like this is a little bit more honest about what was feasible for this project. And of course it cheaps out on the details. You don't have like these cute little like articulated windows here anymore. Cutting like that many like little holes in like a zinc facade is probably very expensive fabrication wise. And yeah, and all this came about is because the budget does not allow for what the rendering promised. This is like just such a huge problem in general. Especially with civic buildings. I mean, I studied concert halls in graduate school, and it was always like that is such a huge problem in concert hall design right now. It's just it never comes out what like it looks like what the rendering promises, and it's always like $1 million, $1 billion of overdue and late and over budget.
I suppose the rendering has become a great tool for the architecture firm and their allies to intimidate non-specialists.
Exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of this, we've got to educate people, especially clients, about like what is feasible. Like this is a perfect example. Look at the second rendering here, right? In reality, the executed building below does look like the second rendering. Like that is what is in the second rendering. why doesn't it look like the second rendering? Because like, how could you expect like a dark zinc facade, a dark zinc cladding to look somehow like effortlessly airbrushed and like somehow reflecting light that is not possible. And it's always dusk and the lighting is always perfect and the glass is always more transparent than like physics itself allows. I mean, it's just a lie. I mean, like, what you see is what you get in that rendering, but the rendering itself is a lie. And like having some sort of skepticism about that is like, will the light actually look like this in this building? Because it doesn't. It looks like the bottom image. And of course there's value engineering involved. Like I'm sure like they could have like done the finishes on this building or like chose a different kind of glass that is more like visually porous. But you know, the truth is like, how much money does the Edmonton Public Library have, right? Like, you know, some things are just not feasible. And it's more important to be upfront about that than to be like, we're going to promise you something spectacular and backpedal on it. And that's just sets up for disappointment. And it also sets up like general disdain for the field of architecture. But yeah, this is like a perennial favorite on Twitter, on like architecture Twitter, about like the perils of like value engineering and like the rendering as God. But of course, sorry, we had to also do this one. This is, whenever I think of like the worst building of like this past century, include like the 21st century up till now, this one always comes to mind. This is so funny to me. This building melted a car. Like, the thing about curves is that they have physical properties that are sometimes hard to predict. And that includes like reflecting or refracting, if it's a convex curve, light and sound and wind and heat. And this is a perfect example of it just like not thinking about that. I mean, just being like, you know, we're going to do it. And also, of course, the sky garden on the top of this building is like actually not a real garden, but it gave them an excuse basically for building on like a conservation easement area, which is like just like totally cynical. But also, I mean, if you're talking about the worst buildings of the 21st century, you have no choice but to include the building that literally melted a car. And that's really all I have to say about that. Also, another value engineering fail. It originally was going to have like louvered screens that would have mitigated the car melting, but those were too expensive. So that's classic. Of course, bespoke fabrication. Buildings and moving parts do not go together, frankly. Just to be very clear here, this rarely ever happens. Well, I mean, I always think of the sort of the apertures that are on the Institut de Monde Arabe by Jean Nouvel, which like were supposed to be like camera apertures, like adjusting to the light, and they don't do that. They just basically don't move. They are very cool looking, but they don't do what they're supposed to do. And so this is of course like Morphosis had to be in here because like they're always doing these like metal screened buildings that end up just looking like monolithic and intimidating when they're supposed to be like transparent and airy and full of light. And it turns out like metal is not transparent, actually. Sorry. It's actually not. And so this is like a classic example of how the architectural impulses for total environmental control and a desire for like some kind of flexibility, and even like environmental bona fides, right? Like, which like basically won Morphosis the commission that he promised to be like, super environmentally friendly with this building, like just basically are irreconcilable. And so like they did things like they omitted the HVAC in the building in exchange for like openable windows, which, you know, this is a federal building. Like there's paperwork, it blows over everywhere. Everyone who works in this building hates it. It's one of the most hated places to work building wise in the country, according to like a national survey. And so like the architects micromanage everything. They even like determined like they made elevators stop at certain floors to make employees walk up the stairs so they could get exercise. Like, I mean, that is micromanaging at like a scale that is ridiculous. I mean, that's truly like modernist brain, where like the building will influence how you live, and like we are going to use that for like some kind of like ulterior motive or whatever. And so also like this sunshade here at the bottom like is supposed to be movable, and it's not. It doesn't move. Turns out, yeah, giant moving parts like in architecture, just like a disaster. Again, something I learned from concert halls.
Maybe we'll get around to talking about the shed at the end.
Oh yeah, well yeah, the shed is a great example. I can't wait for the shed to break personally, which will be soon. Turns out like things are outside.
Yeah, it never rains in a rendering, right?
I know, no, exactly. I wish it would though. That would be cool. So greenwashing, right? This is like, everyone hates this building, especially in England where it is. They put these turbines on there that are supposed to like generate energy, and they don't actually do that. They just basically stopped moving in 2014, which is extremely funny. And so this is like, this whole building was designed to like use environmental sustainability to sell condos to like the 1%. And of course the 1%'s carbon footprint, it far exceeds like any like normal or reasonable person. I always think of that statistic about first class airplane seats being like, I don't know, like generating like 6 times the carbon footprint or whatever of like every other seat in the airplane, which just like classic example. And it's deeply funny to me that like the turbines don't work. Which was the whole point. The whole party of this building was the turbines, and they don't work. And of course, like green energy lip service is like omnipresent in architecture. It's like, oh, we're gonna tack a wind turbine on our like cool little building or whatever to lend it like a little bit of an environmentalist patina, but not too much as to actually make a difference, because that would require like engineering and difficulty and stuff. So this, of course, like I said, will in this little sidebar here, will often devolve into the farcical. And this is truly farcical. It also looks like a razor. Okay, blowing through this because I realize we've been talking for a while. So the perils of big reputations. The Whitney is like not the worst building, obviously, of the 21st century. I hate it though. So I like Renzo Piano. He's probably one of my favorite architects, and I have high expectations for him in general. Renzo Piano's buildings are known for like the fastidiousness and precision of his execution and the attention to detail. And in that respect, the Whitney is disappointing. I mean, and it's a frustrating place to go as a museum. It's frustrating to navigate. I mean, the circulation is mostly reliant on these huge, extremely slow, like elevators. And if you take the stairs, of course you get like a nice view of the waterfront, but the stairs are basically like utility stairs. I mean, it's kind of, it's just disappointing. And so when your museum is praised mostly for its like Instagrammable outside pavilions, rather than the architecture of the interior, that's just not great. I mean, like, if the museum should be about the art, not like your selfies on the patio. And I'm guilty of this. I took selfies on the patio at the Whitney with my husband. Like, it was just, the impulse is irresistible. Very, very good selfie zone. And a lot of Piano's work, like I said, lies in the details. I mean, his work is expressed in the connection between the wall and the ceiling, and like how light fixtures like are hung from the ceiling, how doors open. Like, these all take on a certain finesse. And the Whitney, it doesn't happen. Like, those elements are really awkward at best and like kind of just ugly at worst. Like, this is the backside of the building, and it really is kind of a mess. So, I mean, that's really about disappointment more than anything else for me. Of course, I'm going to be really quick with this. This is great. The US Bank Stadium is great because it kills birds. I mean, that is just like, I mean, not only is it ugly, right? And like just like a architectural testament to sporting culture and like all of its excesses, but this stadium like just unabashedly kills birds. I mean, glass buildings kill like an estimated 365 million to 1 billion birds in the US alone each year. And this one like kills an average of 111 birds every year, which is still a lot of birds. And of course, this death was unnecessary because bird-safe glass was proposed as a solution by bird advocates, and a resolution to implement that was passed at the city council level in Minneapolis. But the architect and developers were just like, no, we're not doing that. And so like, the birds like just died, and there was like no repercussion. I mean, glass is bad anyways. Like, it's energy inefficient. It's got poor sound insulation. It like reflects and generates heat. It's got a high carbon footprint. So, I mean, also it's overused, and really it's just time we did something else as a field, in my opinion. I'm going to try not to get on a soapbox here, because this is like truly my soapbox. And anyone who knows me knows that this is my soapbox, because I'm like the acoustics person. This is like the El Philharmonie is a classic example of technological hubris. I mean, and the funny thing is like the El Philharmonie as a building is handsome. It's got lovely views. I mean, the entryway is spectacular. I mean, the attention to detail is extremely fastidious. That's just the one problem, is that it's a terrible concert hall. I went. I was very excited. I mean, this was like the vanguard of concert hall design, and I studied acoustics. And so for me, like, I was like, this is so great. And I mean, it sounds awful. like it is completely chaotic sounding in there. I mean, it's just like hard to describe. And the reason why is that basically all of these surfaces are algorithmically designed and bespoke fabricated textures that are designed to diffuse sound, break it up and scatter it everywhere. And so, I don't know, like architectural acoustics as a field is not technologically advanced enough to predict or model what that would sound like. So what the acousticians did is they took like basically samples, material samples, and ran tests on that and just guesstimated how it would sound. But like most concert halls, you will not know what it sounds like until it's built. And the result was just a massive disappointment. I mean, there's just too much diffusion, so much so that you can't get like the spatial effects that are necessary for the sort of enveloping concert hall experience. It sounds like really dry and sound goes in weird places and it's weird. And so, I mean, this is the thing that is so frustrating about this is that this was so hyped. Like Wired magazine ran this like glowing feature about how like we're 3D printing and algorithmically generating like new acoustics and like this hall was designed by AI or whatever, which is like a dumb way to say like mathematical like algorithms. It's not machine learning did not design the concert hall. Like they ran an algorithmic thing and it spit out like random patterns that were then translated into like little dips and curves on these little surfaces.
It strikes me that this is like a sonic equivalent to the rendering brain that you spoke about earlier.
Yeah, it is. But also it just goes to show you like the hype and reliance on like technological solutions to certain problems just like can end up having really disastrous results because this concert hall was like built 10 years late and like hundreds of millions of euros over budget. And they just thought it would all be worth it and it's not. And that's frankly, it's just really sad. But I won't go into that. I mean, I could give a whole presentation on the El Harmonia alone, but we're almost done. Okay. The perils of the digital term in form. I hate this building. This is the Times Square Westin by Architectonica. I hate this building. This is one of my most hated buildings ever. It's just every building in the aughts had to make some formal reference to our sort of new digital frontier, which mostly took the form of like doing colored glass and being like, it's pixels just like the internet, which is just really goofy. And of course, this is like tacked on to like faux decon, angular forms, which is like the taste du jour of architecture. And of course, like this is all tinted glass and aluminum paneling. And if you look at this building now, it is absolutely like disgusting looking. Basically, it's been completely tinted by like automobile exhaust. Like there's like little streaks of pollution running from all of these like weird gold glass windows now. I mean, and also you can't find like where the building meets the street because of all the ads, which is kind of funny. I mean, it's extremely tired and a lot of these buildings, in my opinion, have just aged really poorly. Not only like formally, but just like in the execution as well.
It does seem like the billboards betray the actual ethical center of this building, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it, I think that they're kinfolk to one another. I mean, I think that the building itself is an advertisement, which is like stay at Westin. We have like a big colorful box. The advertisements are also advertisements. I mean, I think they're operating on the same depth, to put it that way. Okay, so now, of course, we got to have the vessel.
Can we just remind the audience of the title of your article about this structure?
It was called Fuck the Vessel. I was really mad.
It was pretty definitive, as I recall.
Yes. I always get paid to be mad sometimes, and this was like no exception. I highly recommend you read the piece, mostly because it's funny. It's funny but necessary as an intervention. So I'm gonna leave that at that because we're really like low on time here, and I want to get to the good buildings. But basically, my critique of the vessel is that it's just the epitome of late capitalist access, surveillance state public space, architectural folly designed specifically for like social media selfies. I mean, everything that is like vapid, insipid, and commodifiable about architecture is explicitly ingrained in the vessel as a piece of architecture. That's why I hate it so much. It's not that it looks like a corn cob or like a beehive or whatever. That's dumb. That's boring. Like I hate it because it is literally just like a vessel for capital. I mean, for like Hudson Yards, which is basically a real estate grift that can just charge more for an already multi-million-dollar condo because it merely like faces the vessel.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a total representation of like the privatization and surveillance of public space, which is just, I mean, just terrible, and goes against everything that I believe in with terms of like the right to the city and the role of architecture and placemaking and urban life.
It's really like a Hollywood special effect that's wandered off the screen near you into this somehow. Yeah.
Okay, some good buildings. Sorry I had to put you through some terrible buildings. These are buildings that I like. So, of course, I had to include the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is a great building. It's a beautiful building, and it's a great museum. And a good museum does two things. It educates people and efficiently moves them around. And a great museum turns those two things into a deeply moving experience. And the National Museum of African American History and Culture is a great museum. I mean, its entire architecture basically pays homage to like Black history, from like its ziggurat form and the scrim paneling that recalls like traditional ironwork from like the vernacular South. And what's so fascinating about this is just like the party of how this building came together, which is that you start underground and with no light, and the part of the museum about the Atlantic slave trade. And it takes emancipation as its very program, and you gradually move upward from the darkness of slavery into the light, airy spaces celebrating contemporary Black art and culture. And so this really demonstrates that the form and function of a museum does not have to be detached from like the substance of what that museum aims to teach about. And it in fact can like create like a moving and powerful and uplifting experience rather than just like educating people. And I think I think that's fantastic. I think it's definitely like one of the best museums of like recent history for sure.
Also, the way that it articulates difference on the mall is important.
Yes. It creates sort of like an African corner of the mall with like, of course, like the Washington Monument, which is an obelisk, which is an Egyptian form, which is very cool in my opinion, considering most of what's on the National Mall is like white supremacy. So I'm going to get into social welfare here. I love this building. This is the transformation of 530 dwellings in Bordeaux by Lacaton and Bessel. And so basically they took a social housing building, which was aging, and decided to remodel it and do it in like an ethical way. And so they did it economically by sort of using like these modular structures and keeping the main structure and basically doing a facadectomy and creating like new facade, and like just like making structural changes on the inside. But they also, the architects, like they shared a fundamental belief in the need and benefit for social housing in France. And I always turn to Henri Lefebvre here. He's my favorite French guy. And he believed that the city should be maintained by its citizens as an oeuvre, a work of art, which is done through the act of appropriation, and by appropriation, he means altering and utilizing the built environment according to its use value rather than its exchange value, to put it in Marxist terms. So what might essentially be seen as a boring modern block of flats, it's actually, as you can see in the close-up shot here, it's given color, meaning, and excitement by how those flats are occupied by their inhabitants. They transform these pristine balconies into like a collage of toys, bikes, plants, patio sets, flags, and ultimately like a place that people call home. And I find that to be like extremely meaningful in terms of like, yeah, architecture can create places that are equitable and that allow like the self-expression that comes with like comfort and security in where you live. And I think that's beautiful. And I think the building is beautiful, finely articulated, modern without being boring. I mean, I think it's one of the best projects of the last 10 years easily. So for sustainability, I love Lake Flato. I don't know if this is a problematic flavor or not, but the Naples Botanical Garden Visitor Center is like a really great building. And I think the best eco-architecture in general can just be found in buildings designed to educate people about the natural environment, like botanical gardens, like nature centers, national park buildings. And so inherently sustainability is embedded within like a project like that. And Lake Plato's work is fantastic. It's always beautifully articulated. The attention to material use and circulation is just like pristine. But what really, my favorite thing about this firm and its work is that it extends the concept of sustainability beyond LEED certification and composting toilets and whatever into the landscape itself. And it is such pride and such care is taken with integrating a building into its ecosystem. And that includes landscape architecture. And so that the buildings are a part of that ecosystem rather than just like sitting on top of it and lionizing it. And sustainable architecture, like it just doesn't stop at like the technocratic solutions of green energy and industry standards. It has to take into account and embrace the very environment which it like aims to protect. And that means bridging the divides between somewhat isolated fields like ecology, landscape architecture, and architecture. And it does that. It integrates those fields in a way that is like exemplary to me. And also this particular building is like a favorite of mine because it pays like homage to the Sarasota School of Architecture, namely like Paul Rudolph, and specifically like the Umbrella House, which is like kind of cool, which is like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And so, okay, so this is like a hyped building. If you're in architecture, like you've probably seen this building before. Like it was so hyped, but it's hyped for a reason, which is that it's like extremely good. And so this is, how do we engage with the past in a meaningful way has been a question in architecture for like the last like 50 years, since like the dawn of postmodernism. This has been like the question. And so this building, which is like a modern building by all means, is built with the remains from an 11th century limestone Norman abbey, which is like, first of all, sick. And it's, second of all, it's a breathtaking example of how like architecture preservation and anthropology intersect in like formal terms. And it takes a new look at how to preserve and make meaning of the architectural past without devolving into like adaptive reuse, whitewashing, pastiche ornament, gimmicky additions, facadism. And much of Amin Taha's work interrogates this question, which is how do we generate old buildings for new uses while avoiding the perils of facadism, which is like really like kind of the bane of like modern preservation, in my opinion.
Makes me think of David Chipperfield's Neues Museum as well.
Yeah, exactly. And also, like, if you think about it, like Hardy, Holtzman, Pfeiffer, the Brooklyn Academy of Art, the auditorium, the BAM auditorium, which was like one of the first buildings to do this in like the 1980s.
Yes.
Which is like, it's very cool in my opinion, because like the buildings are alive and their past is not just like brushed over, but actually embraced. And of course, always like every element in all of these buildings that group work does it's fastidiously executed, and it blends a mix of the rusticated and unfinished with the subtle. More materiality at the best contemporary architecture has to offer. And this interior shot I included for that reason. And I like that they included this like little rocking chair because it really does kind of symbolize how they join together like this modern warmth and this rustication. In a way that is, it's just very handsome, frankly. So, of course, Cardboard Cathedral, which is like one of my favorite buildings just because it's a great building. It's so fun. I mean, it's beautiful. And it really is just fun. I mean, it's an eccentric building. They use like materials like 2x4s and like cardboard to somehow just like transform these like really boring materials and, you know, quotidian materials into like an elegant and uplifting religious building. Like this is just so fun to me. I mean, first of all, I love an A-frame. And second of all, I think the use of color is really great. It's simple. It's a simple building. But it's an unself-conscious building, and it's a lighthearted building. And I think it embodies like the best of like what religious architecture has to offer, especially as like a architectural typology, which is the cathedral, which is really somber and plays on the sublime. To subvert that and do something fun and playful, I think is a welcome turn in sacred architecture.
Fascinating to fuse together playfulness and spirituality too in one building.
Yes, I think that's necessary. I think most people like don't go to church, not because like they were going to a funeral or that they like, you know, have medieval beliefs about religion, but because it's like a place of like community and that's meant to like uplift people and get them through like their daily lives. And I think sacred architecture, like embracing that, is is like interesting instead of just like being like it's a really somber and serious place. And then there's my last building here for this PowerPoint, which is Ordnance Road by Peter Barber. And Peter Barber is like my favorite living architect. Everyone who talks to me knows this. And it's because like at the core of his work is like he has this deeply held belief that housing at its core is a human right, and that housing should be both equitable and beautiful. And his whole practice basically is devoted to housing, and specifically his affordable housing. And that's really hard because you have to tackle like questions of development, aesthetics, urbanism that come with housing as a program. And he does this adroitly. I mean, Ordnance Road is a great project. I mean, it masterly blends the organic vernacular from the European city, like the townhouse, for example. And a lot of the architectural gestures that he uses pay homage to like a revolutionary past. And this one reminds me a lot of the Karl Marxhof of Red Vienna fame. Very similar mood, so to speak. And also like there's formal, like this colonnade and like this giant block. The scale of it is quite similar despite being shorter in height. The massing is reminiscent. But also, I mean, Barber's work really demonstrates that the practice of an architect need not be complicit in the systems it wishes to rectify. And that's key. And even if it does exist within those systems, instead of like, a decommodified housing, doing something that is relatively or somewhat commodified, working within those systems can be handled with like care and grace and nuance. And I think that like the thing that's so great is that he's not afraid of that as an architect. Like he's not afraid of like being called a hypocrite because he built like housing that is not like decommodified. Like he understands and handles with grace how to handle these political conflicts within architecture, which is something that most architects like don't do, or they do at a surface level, which is like, we care about climate change, here's our floating city, he, like Barber acknowledges in his work that housing is a political and social and economic problem. And architecture is complicit and ancillary to that, but that it also has a role to play in changing those systems without like uncynically, if that makes sense. And so that's it. I'm sorry for going over the time.
Well, no, it was well worth it. I really love that the last word you said was uncynically, because I feel like that is the value that's at the core of so much of what you've said. We have just a couple of minutes for questions, if that's okay, Kate. And you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen because then people can see.
Okay, yeah.
And your mug. I hope everyone can see what your mug says.
It says I literally can't. And my mom got me the mug because she said it reminded her of the internet humor.
The internet humor, of which we heard so much. So I'm going to just read the first question at the questioner's request, which is, how do you handle criticism? It says for other critics. I think probably she means criticism from other critics. So how do you handle intercritical criticism?
I think that the culture of architectural criticism is a healthy culture right now, at least among its active participants. Like I think of like the other architecture critics who are either syndicated or are working freelance, who it's a very small world. And so like a lot of the conversations that we have amongst ourselves are critical conversations. And also like, I mean, the main criticism of my work is that is of like the politics of my work, which come from a very specific tradition, namely like the sort of Manfredo Tiferi school of architectural criticism. But I think that, and that's, those are interesting and productive conversations. And my mind has been changed by them. And so I think I love actually having these conversations with other critics and hearing their perspective on the issues and how they should be executed architecturally or dealt with. And so I think that it's healthy and necessary, both for like ego deflation purposes, but also just like, criticism isn't a vacuum. It has to be, critics have always criticized one another. I mean, I was thinking of like the Michael Sorkin, like Paul Goldberger fugue of the 80s, which was like a necessary and productive conflict in terms of like how to write the history of the architecture of that time.
Sorry, we had a question there from Joseph. What school of criticism did you say you hail from?
Oh, the Manfredo Tiferi / Michael Sorkin school of criticism.
Okay. That went back by a bit quickly, so just to make sure we got that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a fast talker.
Love it. Okay, let's go to Vesna Kovat. Vesna, you have a question about scale. Do you want to go ahead and ask directly? Maybe that's not working. I'm just going to read it. Okay, Kate, could you comment, please? Architectural drawings for proposed civic and public buildings these days seem to be fantasies and lies, in that they rely on people not realizing how hideous and alienating they will be at full size, which she capitalized. Long stretches of ground level blank wall so ugly to walk along, etc. So can you talk a little bit about scale as part of this rendering problem you've been identifying?
I mean, I think scale is a huge problem, like in general, in terms of like the execution of buildings. Like I think of McMansions always, because they're designed really for a scale totally different than the human scale. That's why they're so huge, and they are intimidating. And I mean, it's interesting because like you would think that architects would know better than that, but I think part of this is like an urbanism question, right? And in America specifically, it's a question of like ground floor development. And there are certain like guidelines, like, you know, design review guidelines and like planning guidelines that specify ground floor development as opposed to the rest of the building. And so that manifests itself architecturally in what, like you rightly said, is often quite boring, especially in multi-use residential commercial buildings. And so part of that is a huge problem with design review in general, and like sort of like these terms, these urbanistic guidelines on how buildings should look that really do result in a lot of like sort of the most hated forms of contemporary architecture, which are like, you know, the 5/1 apartment building, like rules about breaking up masses. Sorry, my dog's back. Rules about like breaking up massing to create sort of what looks like, what is a block size building to make it look like it's not a block size building. Like these often manifest themselves in like bad material use, like clunky execution. And so it's a problem of like of communication and policy between architecture and urbanism and planning. A lot of what we don't realize is like a lot of what like contemporary, especially American urban architecture looks like is a planning problem almost as much as it is an architectural and like economic problem. And so something that is interesting about civic buildings is that it's circulation in civic buildings is weird. Partially, I think of concert halls because like there's things that are necessary, like coat check, for example, ticketing, etc. There's a sort of restriction into who is allowed in that building at what given time, and that manifests itself architecturally. And so one of the things that I think about actually a lot is Herman Hertzberger and what he did with like Music Center of Edinburgh, RIP, because it got lobotomized by a terrible building, which is that the idea that like the entry to like the theater or the concert hall should be like an arcade, and that it should be as much of like a public and like urbanistically transparent space as you know, as an arcade. And so he implemented that, and of course like that all got sort of taken out in the renovation as far as I know, but the goal was to like invite people into those common areas outside of like the times that you were supposed to be in there, namely like concerts. And the Berlin Phil does this too, in terms of like having a gift shop and like having like, they usually have like weekly concerts in the lobby. So like, this is an inviting space in the free concerts that you can go into. So there's a lot of work has been done to sort of like defortressize certain like civic buildings. But I agree with you that like scale is a problem. And how that scale is executed is a difficult problem to solve architecturally when you have to deal with like planning commissions and zoning and all kinds of other stuff. If that makes sense.
Well, Kate, we're a little over time, so I'm going to draw it to a close there.
Okay.
We could talk about so much more. I want to just re-mention something you mentioned earlier, which is that this is not a tremendously lucrative profession for you, and that you do in fact rely on the kindness of strangers and also those known to you through your Patreon account. So if you want to support Kate's bold and adventurous experiments in architectural criticism, which obviously are a very important public service, go to, I guess, your Patreon page. Is that right?
Yeah, it's patreon.com/McMansionHowell.
Of course it is.
Yeah, and it's just so you say, it's like the reason why I can be so outspoken is as a critic is because I have a supplementary income from my blog. If I was just relying on freelancing, I probably would have published like less fanged criticism. Because
Okay.
I'm not financially reliant on freelancing for most of my work. So I can have fewer compromises in my critical voice because of extraneous funding from Patreon,
So
which I
you're,
think is an interesting model for criticism. But
so you're carving out some critical distance quite literally through that.
yeah, exactly. I
Okay.
think distance from institutions is important.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. And thanks in general for the incredible transparency and kind of intellectual spirit that you've approached this. We really appreciate all you put into it. And I really will say that you're a living embodiment of the spirit of self-skepticism that you talked about as being so important in architecture culture. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This was very fun.